It was a bitterly cold winter evening when Mark stepped out of his car, the sound of his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He was exhausted from a long day at work, but the crisp air hit him like a refreshing wave. The quiet of the neighborhood felt almost peaceful, with the snow-dusted trees towering over the streets, their branches heavy with the weight of the frozen night. The world was still, save for the distant sound of his breath clouding the frigid air. It was the kind of night that made you want to wrap yourself in a blanket and enjoy the warmth of your home, a sanctuary from the harsh elements outside. Mark had lived in this little cottage on the edge of town for several years. It was small, cozy, and tucked away just far enough from the noise of the city to provide some peace and solitude. He enjoyed the calm. Something about the quiet nights and the gentle hum of nature soothed him. Most evenings, he'd find himself settling down with a hot cup of tea, reading a book, or watching the flickering fire in the hearth. Life was simple for him, uncomplicated. But on this night, the simplicity of his routine was about to be shattered in a way he could never have anticipated. As Mark walked up his snow-covered driveway, something strange caught his attention. At first, he wasn't sure if it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but as he approached the front door, he heard it again, a soft, whimpering sound. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to draw his attention. The sound came from the side of the house, near the edge of the woods that bordered his property. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. Mark glanced toward the shadows of the trees, and his pulse quickened when he noticed movement. It wasn't the wind. It was too controlled, too deliberate. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he was witnessing. His instincts told him it could be an animal in distress, perhaps a stray dog seeking shelter from the cold. But there was something about the sound, the urgency, that made him feel uneasy. Something didn't sit right. He had lived in this area for years and had never heard a noise quite like that before. Curiosity got the better of him, and with cautious steps, Mark made his way toward the sound. As he rounded the corner of the house, his eyes widened in shock. A pack of wolves stood before him, their large, powerful bodies coated in snow. Their fur was matted, and their eyes gleamed in the moonlight. At first, Mark thought he was seeing things. Wolves didn't just appear in suburban neighborhoods. This was a wild animal he had only ever seen in documentaries, and certainly not this close to his home. There were 5 of them, 3 adults and 2 younger wolves. They were huddled together near the base of the porch, their ears flicking nervously at the slightest movement. They seemed to be waiting, watching Mark with a combination of wariness and curiosity. The scene felt surreal. Wolves were creatures that preferred to stay far away from human settlements. They roamed wild, far from the reach of people. Yet here they were, in his front yard, in the dead of winter, looking for something, or someone. Mark stood frozen, unable to move. His breath hitched as his mind raced. What were these wolves doing here? Was it possible they were lost or in trouble? Wolves were known for their hunting abilities and ability to survive in harsh conditions, but they were also intelligent. Their behavior seemed odd for wild animals. There was a calmness in their demeanor that didn't fit the typical portrayal of wolves as aggressive predators. These were not the wolves he had heard about in stories. These creatures seemed almost human in their expressions. As Mark slowly began to take a step closer, one of the wolves, an older one with dark, intense eyes, looked directly at him. The gaze was penetrating, but there was no hostility in it. Instead, it was almost pleading. The wolf's posture was strange too. It wasn't the usual stance of a wild animal ready to pounce. The creature looked weary, exhausted even. but also deeply trusting, as if it had no intention of harming him. Mark's heart beat faster as the wolves moved closer, their paws leaving prints in the snow. The sound of their breathing was steady and soft, and despite their intimidating size, there was something almost vulnerable about them. As they approached, the man felt an odd pull to them, an invisible thread that seemed to bind him to these wild creatures. Their trust was palpable. Then, without warning, the wolf that had made eye contact with him stepped forward. It didn't growl or show its teeth. Instead, it lowered its head in a way that Mark could only interpret as a sign of submission. It moved toward the front door of the house, pausing for just a moment before gently nudging the door with its nose. Mark stood still, watching in disbelief. The wolves weren't just standing around, they seemed to be signaling something to him. They were asking for something. They were asking to be let in. Mark's mind whirled with confusion. Wolves, wild and untamed, didn't come knocking on people's doors, did they? They were supposed to avoid humans at all costs. But here they were, in front of his home, in the harsh cold, and they weren't leaving. It was clear they were seeking refuge, perhaps desperate for warmth and safety from the biting cold. His initial instinct was to panic, to run inside and lock the door. After all, these were wolves, creatures that could easily overpower a man if they felt threatened. But as he looked into their eyes, he felt no fear. Instead, there was a deep sense of empathy, a need to help. He knew what he had to do. With a shaky hand, Mark reached for the door handle and gently opened it. The warmth of the house spilled out into the night, offering a stark contrast to the freezing temperatures outside. As soon as the door cracked open, the wolves seemed to understand. They didn't charge in recklessly, but instead moved toward the entrance with slow, deliberate steps. One by one, they passed him, each brushing past him with an air of quiet gratitude. Mark stepped aside, his mind racing. This was unreal. Wolves, real wolves, were in his house now, and they were settling in, not in the wild, but in his living room. The man watched in silence as the pack made themselves comfortable, curling up near the fireplace. They were exhausted, clearly. Their fur was matted with snow, their faces etched with weariness. But despite the cold and the roughness of their lives in the wild, they didn't seem threatening. Mark closed the door behind them, still in a state of disbelief. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, or how long the wolves would stay. All he knew was that for reasons he couldn't explain, he had made the right decision in letting them in. He had followed his instincts, and somehow, those instincts had led him to an incredible, unexplainable moment. His mind raced with questions, but as he watched the wolves settle into the warmth of the house, his focus shifted to something far more immediate, the strange, quiet bond that had formed between them. This wasn't just a man helping animals in need, it was something deeper, something profound, and Mark was about to discover just how truly extraordinary this encounter was. It felt like the wolves weren't just seeking refuge, they were looking for something else, something only Mark could give. The night had taken a mysterious turn, and he was about to uncover the true reason behind their visit. What could these creatures, usually so elusive and wild, want from him? Why had they come to his doorstep? What would happen next? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Mark's life would never be the same again. Mark stood in the middle of his living room, staring at the 5 wolves sprawled on the floor before him. The flickering flames in the fireplace cast dancing shadows across their fur, illuminating their tired eyes. But still, they made no move. They simply lay there, exhausted from the cold, their chests rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The quiet was nearly overwhelming. The wind howled outside, but inside, everything seemed strangely calm, almost surreal. Mark had always thought he understood animals in some way, having spent much of his life around pets and wildlife in his younger years, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. Wolves, wild and untamed, were now sharing his home, and somehow it felt right. At first, he couldn't quite understand the gravity of the situation. The initial shock of seeing them at his doorstep was still fresh in his mind. Now, with the warmth of the house surrounding him, Mark found himself caught in a strange sense of awe and confusion. These wolves, creatures that belonged in the wild, were lying here on his floor, seeking shelter and, for reasons that were unclear, his company. It wasn't just the cold they were running from. That much was obvious. They had found their way into his life for a purpose. But what could that purpose be? The wolves didn't seem to be hungry, at least not in the way Mark would expect. They hadn't made any noise to suggest they were looking for food, and while they had been cold when they first arrived, now they appeared comfortable, at ease. He hadn't noticed it before, but there was a certain sense of grace to their movements, a quiet dignity even. These were not the aggressive, snarling beasts he had seen in movies or read about in books. They were intelligent, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. They seemed at peace in this place. Mark's gaze shifted from one wolf to the next. The largest of the pack was closest to the fireplace, its fur a dark shade of brown, almost black, that blended seamlessly into the shadows. Its eyes gleamed with an intensity that held Mark's attention. This was the wolf that had led the others to the door, the one that had approached him first, the one that had looked into his eyes with that deep, almost pleading expression. There was something about this wolf that Mark couldn't quite shake off, a feeling that it was more than just a wild animal seeking shelter. It seemed to know him in some way, or at least to recognize something in him. For the next few moments, Mark simply watched. The wolves didn't show any signs of restlessness or discomfort. They were calm, their focus on the warmth and safety of the room, their posture relaxed. There was no growling, no pacing, nothing to indicate that they were a threat. Mark had seen wild animals up close before, but never in his home, never in such an intimate setting. These wolves, despite their wildness, felt more like guests than intruders. It was then that Mark realized something. The wolves hadn't just come in out of the cold. They had come to him. There was no mistaking it. They had sought him out. They had come to his doorstep, had looked at him with those eyes, and had asked for his help. But the question that lingered in his mind was, why? He had never been one to believe in mystical things or stories of animals with hidden motives. But this felt different. There was a quiet urgency in the way they had approached him, something almost desperate in the way they had gathered around his front door. And yet, they hadn't acted recklessly or aggressively. They had been careful, cautious even, as if they knew exactly what they were doing. As the minutes passed, Mark found himself sitting down on the couch, his legs still shaking from the initial shock. He didn't want to move too quickly, didn't want to startle the wolves. His thoughts were a whirlwind. He thought about calling someone, maybe animal control, but that didn't feel right. These were not ordinary animals. They were different. They weren't here by accident, and whatever the reason for their presence, it was important. He could feel it in his gut. Despite the uncertainty, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to help them. He didn't know why, but it was as if something deep within him had drawn him to this moment, to these wolves. Perhaps it was his love for animals, or perhaps it was something more profound. He couldn't say. But as he sat there, watching them, something began to stir within him. A quiet understanding that these wolves were more than just creatures in need of shelter. They had come to him for something else, something that was still hidden, something that only time would reveal. The silence in the room was broken when the large wolf, closest to the fire, suddenly stirred. It raised its head, its eyes locking with Mark's. The intensity in its gaze was enough to make his heart skip a beat. It wasn't a threatening look, nor was it aggressive. It was something else. The wolf slowly stood up, its body moving with fluid grace, and it began to walk towards Mark. He felt his breath catch in his throat, unsure of what to expect. But the wolf didn't lunge or growl. It simply moved closer, its eyes never leaving Mark's. Mark sat frozen, unsure of what to do. Was the wolf trying to communicate with him? Could it be asking for something more than just shelter? He could feel his pulse quicken, the air in the room suddenly thick with tension. The wolf stopped just a few feet away from him and sat down, its posture still calm, but its gaze unwavering. It was almost as if it was waiting for Mark to say or do something. Mark's mind raced. He didn't know how to respond to this. This wasn't something that happened every day, but the connection between them was undeniable. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence, save for the crackling of the fire. Mark swallowed hard, still unsure of what was happening. Then, without a word, the wolf gently turned its head and glanced back toward the door. Mark followed its gaze and saw the other wolves beginning to stir, shifting slightly, but not making any aggressive movements. They all seemed to be watching him, waiting for something. It was then that Mark realized what the wolf was trying to tell him. The animals weren't just seeking shelter. They were seeking something deeper. They weren't here by accident. They were here for a reason. Mark wasn't sure what that reason was, but he couldn't ignore the feeling deep in his chest that this encounter was no ordinary meeting of man and beast. There was a message in their presence, something that was yet to be revealed. He stood up slowly, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. He took a tentative step toward the large wolf, unsure of what would happen next. The wolf watched him with its piercing gaze, not moving, just observing. As Mark drew closer, the wolf's posture seemed to soften, its eyes reflecting something almost familiar. It was as if it recognized him, as if it knew him in a way he couldn't comprehend. He stopped just a few inches away, and for a long moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then, without warning, the wolf stepped back, its gaze never leaving Mark's. It turned and walked toward the door, looking back at him, as if it was inviting him to follow. Mark hesitated for a moment, caught in the pull of the wolf's silent command. But then slowly, he took a step forward, his curiosity overriding any hesitation. As he reached the door, the wolves began to move toward it, one by one. They didn't rush, they didn't force their way out. Instead, they walked calmly, as though they knew exactly where they were going. Mark opened the door slowly, the cold air rushing in, but he didn't care. He followed them, unsure of what he was about to witness. The wolves, now outside, paused and looked back at him. The large wolf, the one that had first approached him, stood at the edge of the woods, its tail slightly raised as if waiting for him to catch up. Mark took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was about to discover, but he knew that this wasn't just an ordinary night. He had been chosen for something that was about to unfold in a way that would change his life forever. Without thinking, he stepped outside, following the wolves into the unknown. The chill of the night air seemed to cut through him, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on the creatures ahead, their steady pace guiding him deeper into the forest. What lay ahead? What would these wolves reveal to him next? He didn't know, but he was determined to find out. Mark stepped out into the cold night air, the crisp wind biting at his face as he followed the wolves into the woods. He had no idea what was driving him, why he felt so compelled to follow these wild creatures. It wasn't just the strange connection he felt with them, nor the curiosity about why they had come to him in the first place. It was as if something beyond his understanding was guiding him, something that pulled him forward, step by step, deeper into the woods. The wolves moved with confidence, their bodies sleek and silent in the moonlight. They didn't look back as they trotted ahead, but Mark knew they were aware of him. The large brown wolf, the one who had led the pack, was always at the front, moving with a purposeful stride. Mark kept his pace steady, not wanting to lose sight of them. The forest around him was eerily quiet, the only sound being the crunch of snow beneath his boots. The air was thick with stillness, and for a moment, Mark wondered if he was dreaming. It all seemed so surreal, so out of place. He had never imagined he would be out in the woods at this hour, following a pack of wolves into the unknown. He glanced up at the sky, the stars twinkling high above. The moon was nearly full, casting a silvery light that illuminated the path ahead. The trees, their branches heavy with snow, created a canopy overhead, making the night feel even more secluded. It was a world apart from the warm comfort of his home. Yet, despite the unfamiliarity of it all, Mark felt strangely at peace. The unease that had initially gripped him had slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of wonder. As he followed the wolves, Mark found his mind racing with questions. What did they want from him? Why had they come to him, of all people? These were creatures of the wild, animals who roamed far from human settlements. Yet here they were, seeking something from him, leading him through the woods as if they had a purpose. Mark had no answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't turn back now. He had to see this through. The further they walked, the deeper they went into the forest, and the more Mark felt a growing sense of anticipation. The wolves didn't stop or hesitate. They moved as if they knew exactly where they were going. Mark couldn't help but feel as though he was part of something bigger, something ancient. The woods around him seemed alive with energy, as if they were waiting for something. The trees loomed over him like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. Suddenly, the wolves slowed their pace. Mark followed suit, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. The trees parted slightly, revealing a small clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone structure, its crumbling walls covered in vines and moss. It looked ancient, forgotten by time, as though it had stood there for centuries. The air around the structure felt different, charged, almost magical. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. The wolves too had stopped, and they stood at the edge of the clearing, watching Mark intently. The large brown wolf looked back at him once more, and then, without hesitation, it stepped forward, its paws light on the snow-covered ground. The other wolves followed, moving with a quiet grace. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step forward, feeling the pull of the moment. He had no idea what he was about to discover, but something told him that this was the moment. This was why the wolves had come to him. As he approached the stone structure, Mark noticed the intricate carvings on the walls. They were worn and faded, but there was no mistaking the detail. Symbols and markings that seemed to tell a story, an ancient story that he couldn't quite decipher. The wolves circled the structure, their eyes never leaving him. It was as if They were guiding him, urging him to uncover something hidden in the past. Mark reached out a hand, his fingers grazing the surface of the stone. The moment he touched it, a jolt of energy coursed through his body, making his hair stand on end. He pulled his hand back, startled, but the sensation lingered. There was something powerful about this place, something that resonated deep within him. It was as though the stone itself was alive, waiting for him to unlock its secrets. For a moment, Mark stood there, unsure of what to do next. The wolves had stopped moving, their eyes focused on him. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Mark took a deep breath of his own, steadying himself. He had come this far. He couldn't stop now. Slowly, cautiously, he began to walk around the structure, his fingers still brushing against the stone as he examined the carvings. They were unlike anything he had ever seen before. Symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. Some were familiar, reminiscent of ancient runes or tribal markings, while others were completely alien, almost incomprehensible. Yet, despite their strangeness, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he understood them. It was as though they were speaking to him in a language he didn't quite know, but somehow felt. As he moved around the structure, he came to a small opening in the stone, barely large enough for a person to fit through. The entrance was narrow, its edges jagged and worn. The wolves, sensing his presence near the opening, stopped at a distance, their eyes still locked on him. They didn't move, didn't growl or bark. They simply waited, as if allowing him to make the next move. Mark hesitated for a moment, unsure of what lay beyond the entrance. But the pull of the moment was too strong. He had to know what was inside. He took a deep breath, pushed aside the creeping fear that threatened to rise within him, and stepped forward. The narrow passageway opened up before him, and he slipped inside. The air within the structure was cool and damp, and the smell of earth and moss filled his nostrils. The walls were rough, the stone damp from years of exposure to the elements. Mark could barely make out the details in the dim light, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw something that made his heart race. In the center of the chamber was an ancient altar, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. It was made of the same stone as the walls, but the carvings on it were far more intricate, more detailed. Mark approached the altar cautiously, his fingers tracing the carvings on its surface. The symbols were unlike anything he had seen before. They seemed to pulse with energy, as though they were alive. As he touched one of the symbols, a sudden flash of light erupted from the altar, blinding him for a moment. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. When the light faded, he found himself standing in the center of a vision. He was no longer in the chamber. Instead, he was standing in a vast, open landscape, an ancient forest perhaps, or a place long forgotten by time. The wolves were with him, their eyes glowing in the moonlight. But they were not just wolves anymore. They were something more, something powerful. Their forms seemed to shimmer and shift, as though they were both animal and spirit, ancient guardians of this place. Mark felt a surge of energy coursing through him, as though the very earth beneath him was alive with power. He looked around, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The landscape stretched out before him, untouched by time. The trees were older than anything he had ever known, their trunks massive and gnarled. The air was thick with the scent of the forest, and the ground was soft beneath his feet. As he gazed around in awe, one of the wolves, specifically the large brown one, stepped forward. Its eyes locked with Mark's, and in that moment, Mark understood. The wolves were not just animals. They were protectors of this place, guardians of an ancient power that had been hidden away for centuries, and Mark had been chosen to protect it. The realization hit him like a wave. He had been brought here for a reason. The wolves had led him to this sacred place, and now it was up to him to carry on their legacy. The weight of it all settled over him, but strangely, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like destiny. The wolves weren't just seeking shelter from the cold, they were seeking a new guardian, someone who could protect the ancient power hidden within these woods. As the vision began to fade, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. He knew without a doubt that this was his calling. He had found his purpose, and with it, a bond that could never be broken. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the chamber, standing before the altar. The wolves were still with him, watching him with a silent understanding. Mark took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling in. The wolves had led him here, and now it was time for him to embrace his destiny. He was no longer just a man. He was a guardian, a protector of an ancient power that had been waiting for someone like him. The journey was far from over, but Mark knew one thing for sure: he would never be the same again, and neither would the wolves. As Mark stood there, surrounded by the wolves, the realization that his life had been irrevocably changed settled in. The weight of it felt almost unbearable at first, but as the minutes passed, a sense of calm began to wash over him. He was no longer the man he had been when he stepped out of his house that evening. The connection between him and the wolves, the mysterious force that seemed to draw him forward into this forgotten place, had unlocked something deep within him, something that resonated with an ancient power he couldn't fully comprehend, but knew he was meant to protect. The wolves were not just creatures of the wild. They were guardians, protectors of an ancient secret that had been hidden away for centuries. Mark had always believed in the beauty of the natural world, in the raw power of the animals that roamed its vast expanses, but he had never imagined that he would be chosen to stand alongside them as one of their own. He had spent his life observing animals, understanding their behaviors, respecting their place in the world. But now, the roles had reversed. The wolves had chosen him, and they were waiting for him to embrace the responsibility that came with their trust. Mark felt the weight of their gaze as they stood silently around him, their eyes glistening in the dim light of the chamber. It wasn't just a look of expectation. It was a silent promise, an unspoken bond that had been forged in the depths of the forest and the uncharted corners of time. They knew what he had to do. They had led him here, to this place of power, where the very earth hummed with ancient energy. And now, they were waiting for him to unlock the next step in his journey. It was then that Mark noticed something he hadn't seen before. The altar before him, covered in dust and age, had started to shimmer in the faint light that filtered through the crumbling walls of the chamber. The symbols on the altar, those strange and alien markings, now seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. They were no longer just carvings. They were alive, shifting and changing in ways that defied logic. As Mark stepped closer, drawn by an unseen force, the air around him thickened, almost as if the space itself was alive and waiting for his touch. He reached out, his hand trembling, as he placed it on the surface of the altar. The moment his skin made contact with the stone, a surge of energy coursed through him, so intense that it felt as though his very soul was being pulled into the depths of the earth. He gasped, stumbling back for a moment, his heart racing. But the wolves remained still, their eyes fixed on him as though they had known this would happen. For a moment, everything went black. Then, without warning, the vision returned. Mark found himself standing on a vast plain, the sky above him a deep, almost otherworldly blue. The wind whipped through the tall grasses that surrounded him, the scent of wildflowers and earth heavy in the air. But it was the sight before him that left him breathless. Across the plain stood a group of wolves, their forms shining like silver in the sunlight. They were not the wolves he had followed into the forest, but something more, something ancient and powerful. These wolves were larger, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. Mark instinctively knew that these were the spirits of the wolves, the ancestors who had walked the earth long before him. They were the ones who had watched over this land, ensuring that its secrets remained hidden. They were the guardians, and now they were speaking to him. Without words, they beckoned him forward. Mark took a hesitant step, but as soon as his foot touched the earth, the ground beneath him seemed to respond. The energy in the air shifted, becoming more tangible, more real. He could feel the pulse of the land beneath him, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, waiting for someone to awaken it. As he moved closer, one of the wolves stepped forward. It was the largest of them, its fur as white as snow, its eyes shimmering with an ancient wisdom that seemed to pierce through him. The wolf stopped just a few feet away, and Mark felt his breath catch in his throat. The wolf looked at him with an intensity that was both comforting and terrifying at once. For a long moment, there was silence between them. But in that silence, Mark understood something. This wolf wasn't just offering him guidance, it was offering him a choice. The vision shifted again, and Mark found himself standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around him. Below, the forest stretched out, dark and sprawling, the trees standing like silent sentinels. The wolves were there too, standing beside him. Their eyes were fixed on the horizon, on something far beyond the distance Mark could see. One of the wolves turned to him, its eyes meeting his. This time, Mark heard a voice, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. The choice is yours. Mark didn't understand at first. What choice? What was he being asked to do? He had come here with the wolves, followed them into the woods, touched the altar, and now he was standing at the edge of something far greater than he could have ever imagined. The wolves had brought him here, but what was his role in all of this? Why had he been chosen? The wolf's gaze softened, and for the first time, Mark felt the full weight of the responsibility that had been placed on him. It was not just a matter of guarding the secret of the forest, of standing watch over the land and its creatures. It was about something far deeper, something that was connected to the very fabric of life itself. The wolves had chosen him, but they had also trusted him to understand the land, to understand the delicate balance that had existed for centuries. Mark's mind raced. He thought about the things he had seen, the visions, the wolves, the sense of power that had pulsed through his body when he touched the altar. He understood now that this wasn't just about the wolves. It wasn't just about the forest or the land. It was about preserving something that could easily be lost, something that had been kept hidden for eons. The wolves were not just protectors of the land. They were the guardians of a secret that had to remain safe, or else everything would fall apart. And Mark, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, was the one who had been chosen to carry that burden. As the vision faded and Mark returned to the stone chamber, he felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The wolves were still around him, their silent presence a reminder of the task before him. He wasn't just in this alone. The wolves, with all their ancient knowledge, were here to guide him. They had brought him to this place, to this moment in time, and now it was up to him to take the next step. Mark turned toward the wolves, his heart full of both fear and determination. He had seen the future, or at least a glimpse of it. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just a man wandering through the woods anymore. He was part of something much larger than himself, something that stretched back through the ages. And now, the wolves were waiting for him to accept his role in this ancient legacy. One by one, the wolves moved toward him, each of them stopping in front of him, their eyes locked onto his. They were not just animals, they were not just guardians, they were his companions, his guides, and now his family. Mark took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy. He would face challenges, dangers, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that he was not alone. The wolves were with him. The ancient power of the land was with him. And somehow, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the wolves began to move out of the chamber, Mark followed, his heart steady now. He had made his decision. He was ready to embrace the responsibility that had been placed upon him. The journey ahead would be long and filled with uncertainty, but he was no longer afraid. Together, they walked into the night, the wolves leading the way, their eyes glowing with the ancient knowledge of the earth. Mark, once an ordinary man, now stood alongside them, bound by a purpose that transcended time itself. The forest, the wolves, and the secret they guarded were all part of him now. And with that knowledge, he stepped forward, ready to protect the land and its ancient power, no matter what the future held. If you're as amazed by this story as we are, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible content.